Kamakailan ay pinirmahan ni President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. ang kanyang Administrative Order number 22 na nag-create ng Special Committee on Human Rights Coordination na naglalayong daw na palakasin ang human rights sa bansa. Para sa episode na ito ng Rappler Talk, makakasama natin ang senior researcher ng Human Rights Watch na si Carlos Conde para himayin kung may benepisyo nga ba ang bagong AO number 22 ni Marcos para sa human rights situation ng ating bansa. Welcome to Rappler Talk, Sir Kaloy.
Hi, Jairo. Salamat for having me. I'm glad to do this.
Sir, first things first, the order was publicized last week, specifically Sunday. Inannounced na pinirmahan ni President Marcos yung AO number 22. And the first thing that comes to people's minds, especially dun sa mga pangkaraniwang tao natin, ay hindi ba ito redundant dun sa Commission on Human Rights natin na sinabi na ng Constitution na this is a constitutional commission na kailangan na may mandate na i-promote yung human rights sa bansa. What's the first thing that came to your mind as a human rights worker working in the Philippines and focusing on the human rights situation in the Philippines when this was announced?
Well, that's certainly one of the things that came to mind when we learned about this. Administrative Order 22, and I thought that what is this? This is something that there's definitely more to this than what the president is saying. But then on the other hand as well, this is something that we saw coming, because if you remember, Jairo, siguro mga weeks before, the whole idea of a human rights coordinating committee was already discussed. In fact, nagmi-meeting na ang mga DOJ with some agencies in government to try to convene what at the time was not a special committee, but was just a committee. So we sort of saw this coming. But the reason why we thought this was and also I agreed with some of the observation that this was redundant is because the government made such a fuss, a big to-do about this when they announced this, making it appear that this is something that one of the most significant human rights, I would say, development in the country since Marcos came to office. And to some degree, merong katotohanan yun, but it needs to be unpacked. There's a lot of things that needs to be unpacked. But before I go all into that and probably also entertain some of your questions, I have to point out that we're not saying the government cannot take actions to solve the serious human rights problems in the Philippines. I mean, in fact, we've been calling on the Philippine government to do that. But whether this is the way to do it is the question.
Yeah. Interesting point, sir. And on the announcement and on the administrative order that was signed by Marcos, he pointed out that there's a need to sustain the UN Joint Program, which is basically a mechanism or tool of the United Nations to help to have a technical cooperation with the Philippines to address the so-called human rights situation in the Philippines. What's your comment on that, sir? That there should be the UNJP should be sustained, or the effects at least of the UNJP should be sustained?
Well, here's the thing. If you're going to sustain something, if you're going to continue doing that something, it's on the assumption or on the knowledge that that something is working, is beneficial, okay? Now, the UN Joint Program, we have to keep in mind, was the result of a compromise between the Philippine government and UN Human Rights Council member states back in 2021. The reason this came about was because the Philippine government fought really hard to prevent the United Nations Human Rights Council to launch an investigation, a commission, an inquiry, whatever, on the serious drug war killings that was happening. The Philippine government at the time, still under President Duterte, really lobbied hard, really fought hard. In fact, they even attacked human rights groups in Geneva, including us, Human Rights Watch, because of our position that the Philippine government is not serious about human rights, which is why they were trying to prevent a commission and inquiry. In fact, the Philippine Human Rights, the Presidential Human Rights Committee, which is now the secretariat of this special committee, was one of the leading agencies that was undermining, that was questioning the credibility of human rights defender in Geneva when the UNJP was being considered. Now, initially, we did not support the UNJP because what we wanted, a lot of human rights organizations wanted was accountability. They wanted investigation into the drug war killing. The UNJP was not for that purpose. The UNJP, and this is where we sort of agreed with it, was designed as a technical assistance program, capability building program to improve, to institutionalize human rights protection, help law enforcers to investigate and all of that. Now, we all supported that. That's why our support for the UNJP was kind of conditioned on that, because no one wants to, no one wants to see the Philippine government to be still stuck in, in wrong methods in terms of pursuing human rights investigation. We want the law enforcers and the Philippine government to improve. The problem is that the UNJP failed to do any sort of accountability action. It was hampered by the fact that the pandemic was happening when it was convened, and also the fact that in the initial years of the UNJP, the Philippine government was not fully cooperating with it, which is why na-delay yung pag-enforce ng UNJP program na yan. Ito lang naman nakaraang taon na medyo umarangkada siya. Even then, talagang hindi pa ganun lubos-lubusan ang pag-support ng mga government agencies sa UNJP. So the long and short of it is that from our perspective, the UNJP is a failure as far as accountability is concerned. Now, the question now is, why would anybody, the Philippine governments, continue doing something that failed? So, ang tingin namin dito, this was because the AO 2022 and also the special committee is a political move. This is part of Mr. Marcos's charm offensive with the international community. This morning in a forum, human rights lawyer Chel Jokno even adverted to a theory that the Philippine government is now pushed for the creation of this committee because this is part of their campaign to win a seat at the Human Rights Security UN Security Council. I'm sorry. So a lot of questions. Are still there. We don't think that this committee will do what it's supposed to do. In fact, it's a very, very vague yung mga gustong gawin tungkol dito, and we're not even talking about the composition of the committee yet. What are they going to do, and what are the background of these different government agencies?
Yeah, and aside from the problem with yung nag-compromise ng UNJP between the UN Security Council member states and the Philippines, local groups in the Philippines, not them groups, rights groups, also criticize yung UNJP na up until now ay wala pa rin daw malino na assessment if it was effective in addressing the problems with the Philippines. What can you say about that, sir?
That's an interesting question, Jairo, because indeed, and in fact, maraming sa mga meeting namin with the UN, we've always kind of almost demanded that there has to be an assessment of how the UNJP performed. But this did not happen. Now, the UN in the Philippines, they're at to put it bluntly, they're at the mercy of the Philippine government. Hindi sila makagalaw hanggat walang basbas ng Philippine government. That's just how it is. So walang assessment, walang nangyaring paglalagom, pag-analisa whether the UNJP actually worked and performed its mandate. So doon tayo ngayon, part of the skepticism comes from that. Hindi malinaw kung ano ba talaga ang nagawa ng UNJP with all the money that it got from various donors. What exactly has the UNJP achieved apart from holding meetings with several NGOs, with several stakeholders in government, and talking about how to improve the human rights condition? And now there's nothing wrong with that per se, but again, you have to see the proportionality of these response, because the UNJP is a response to a human rights crisis. You have to look at the proportionality of that with juxtaposed with what is happening on the ground in terms of the thousands of people being killed uh, uh, in the drug war and the drug war that's still happening. So, yun, malinaw na hindi nakatugon yung UNJP sa pangangailangan ng bansa na matapos yung karahasan at maimbestigahan yung mga may kasalanan dito.
Yeah. Now, let's move forward, sir, to the composition or on the composition of the AO number 22. This was pointed out by our friends from Bayan, specifically Bayan, President Nato Reyes. He pointed out that the members of the AO22 were also the members of the Anti-Terrorism Council who can arbitrarily designate people as terrorists. At nakita naman natin how the ATC used its power to crack down on government critics and progressives, specifically yung mga members ng progressive groups, and they were designated without further investigation as terrorists. So ano pong comment nyo dun sa part na yun, na the irony na, yun nga, the problem with red tagging, and now the same people who implement the ATC, or who has the power to implement the ATC's power, now sits in the AO number 22.
Well, I agree with that on that view, because to be honest, and that's the key kind of concern that we have about this special committee, about this super body. Why would it be dominated by several agencies who not only have questionable or poor human rights record, but are also, in fact, they actually, in fact, played a role in some violations of the rights of Filipinos. So, although it's not specifically pointed out in the AO 22, I think that the ATC will be part of that. I think it's one of those optional kind of memberships, in much the same way that the CHR can be a member of the committee. It is not an unreasonable, I would say, fear that the ATC and many other agencies who are responsible for many of these human rights violations are running the super body. So apart from the ATC, there's the DILG. Now the DILG, the Department of the Interior and Local Government, has administrative control of the Philippine National Police. This is the same Philippine National Police that's responsible for thousands and thousands of killings in the drug war during the 30s time and even today. And the DLG has no record of ever conducting an honest-to-goodness investigation, disciplining or acting on the prosecution of members of the police force who have been implicated in these serious abuses. So malinaw, talagang hindi lang siya. I don't think it's just a simple matter of irony. It's a travesty, if you ask me. Then we go to the Philippine Presidential Human Rights Committee, which is the secretariat of the special committee. I mean, that is laughable, if you ask me. The PHRC is the number one apologist of the Philippine government when it comes to human rights issues it confronts. The PHRC, contrary to its name, is the number one propagandist by the Philippine government in twisting the human rights situation in the Philippines. It does that here, it does that through the press, and it even does that in Geneva during Human Rights Council sessions. So, it's very clear that this special committee is designed more for political reasons than for actual human rights reasons. So it's laughable, it's a travesty, and I think, if only for this inconsistent factors and the fact that all these members of the committee have no credibility at all on human rights, it is for this reason that it should be opposed and it should be exposed by CSOs locally and internationally.
Yeah. Aside, sir, from being composed by government agencies and officials who have questionable background on human rights, you also pointed out in the HRW website that human rights super body of Marcos will have no participation from CSOs, from the United Nations and rights groups in the Philippines. What would be the implication of that?
Well, look, let's put it this way. In the UNJP, it was clear that the UN was there. It was also clear that the NGOs, the civil society groups, were there, even though their participation was severely hamstrung by a resistance from the government. And even then, it didn't work as well as it should. Okay. Now, the problem here is that without UN participation, without CSO participation, and not even the Commission on Human Rights has a direct participation in the committee. What it means is that the committee is one big echo chamber, basically, of agencies that have questionable track record on human rights and are now in a position to mislead the world about what's happening in the Philippines. Is it unreasonable to suspect that perhaps from this day on, the committee will proclaim to the world that all of these killings that are being investigated by the House of the University of the Philippines are not true? It's not unreasonable to suspect that because these agencies, these individuals in the committee have that track record. I mean, they even red tag people, they even undermine human rights groups. So talagang without CSO participation in this committee, I'm not saying that CSOs should take part in this travesty because I don't think any self-respecting CSO will want to take part in a travesty such as this. But doon mo makikita yung intention na hindi talaga human rights ang intention nila because as we pointed out in our statement today, the loudest voice of human rights in the Philippines come from the civil society organization. Without involving them, without even talking to them in the initial stages of the creation of this committee, that can only mean that this is designed for something else, that this is not for accountability, and this is not with the end in view of getting justice for all the victims of human rights abuses in the Philippines.
Yeah. And another thing, sir, let's compare the situation with the earlier AO that we have, specifically AO number 35, which was signed to supposedly address extrajudicial killings in the Philippines. It was currently chaired by the Department of Justice, and under Duterte, for example, in the Bloody Sunday incident, 9 activists were killed, and the AO 35 pursued the cases against policemen. But when the Marcos administration entered, eventually the same case that were filed by the Department of Justice were also dismissed by the same body. So, pwede po natin masabi na parang baka maulit lang ulit na makita natin na another AO na formed by the government na hindi functional katulad ng AO number 35.
Oh, definitely. I think it's a reasonable thing to expect. AO 35, the much vaunted AO 35. In fact, if I don't think there's any other kind of initiative or AO or EO or whatever there are that the Philippine government has been exploiting to point out that they're doing something about the human rights situation in the Philippines, specifically the attacks against political activists. They've been trotting out the AO 35, the creation of the AO 35 as their, a response to the human rights problems, the killings of activists. But when you look at their performance, it's barely there. Now, the thing with the civil society groups is that we always want to give the Philippine government the benefit of the doubt. We always want to see that, to prove itself that this is serious. And that is the case with the AO 35. We all knew that when this AO was passed, it was passed at a time when really serious rights violations are happening, and it was undeniable that something needs to be done. And even if some of us were skeptical about what it can achieve, we still let it, sige, tuloy nyo lang yan, it's better than nothing, parang ganun yung ano. But then now we see that it's not as optimal as it should be. And we fear that this AO 22 will suffer the same fate. Probably even worse, because, the it seems to us that the motivation for AO22 is much more, I would say, cynical than AO35. I'm cynical in the sense that if the theory is true that this was part of the charm offensive of the Marcos government to win a seat at the UN Security Council, then that only tells you that they're not really serious about human rights. And finally, I forgot Jairo to point out about accountability is this. Really, apart from making sure that the CHR, the Commission on Human Rights, should take the leadership in resolving human rights issues, and that would necessitate, giving it resources and making sure that it is independent. Um, the fact that the Marcos administration has said time and again that it will not cooperate with the ICC, that in itself is the best kind of indication that they're not serious about human rights, that they're not serious about accountability. What's stopping Mr. Marcos, if he's really serious about human rights, what's stopping Mr. Marcos from helping the ICC or allowing the ICC to come in to do their job in investigating the alleged crimes against humanity during their time? But they're not doing that. So you have to ask why.
Yeah. Just to double down, sir, on the benefits of this AO to the Marcos administration, after her visit to the Philippines, UN Special Rapporteur Irene Can said that the state here in the Philippines is still problematic. She even recommended the abolition of the NTF-ELCAC, and then UN Special Rapporteur Can then said that UN body can actually pressure the government because yun nga, the Philippines is gunning for a seat at the Human Rights Security Council, in another body for the UN body for women. So ito po ba talaga, just can you expound more on how can this AO benefit the face of Marcos, especially that since he took the office or he was elected in the office, Marcos really started out, cleaning his name, and then pinapakita niya sa mundo na yung facade niya na he's different from his predecessor, Duterte.
Well, it's part of that. I mean, ever since he took office in 2022, Mr. Marcos has, has not missed a beat in terms of promoting himself or his administration to the international community. I mean, we all know that his motivations for running were, to make sure that the Marcos name is rehabilitated, and probably also to make sure that whatever money that they have stolen will be kept. So these are all facts. These are all motivations that we cannot ignore. Now, this could be part of that offensive, charm offensive. The context here, Jairo, I think is also important. Marcos is coming from a regime like Duterte that was really bad. And so the international community, the Europeans, the West, the US, they were hungry for some, good interaction with the Philippines. They were, they wished that all that animosity, all that confrontation, all that nastiness that happened under Duterte will go away, and so that they can move forward and help the Philippines. Because let's not kid ourselves. They do find some ways to help the Philippines one way or another. And so with Marcos coming along and very eager to please the international community, of course they took that. Does that explain the kind of I would say disinterest in human rights that we're seeing in some of them? Probably. The fact alone that no member state of the UN Human Rights Council was willing to extend the UNJP, because that's one of the calls. Extend the UNJP, strengthen it, make it better. The fact that no one of these countries supported that call, is indicative of how they just want to move forward. And also the fact that Mr. Marcos did not want to extend the UNJP, regardless of the assessment by CSOs and probably even by the UN itself, that it needs to do more to justify its existence. Then it tells you that they want to use this for something, for political. Probably we don't really know, but we can only guess. Now, the thing is, the UNJP would have been a great program if it had been extended, and if it had been strengthened, and if its mandate were made a little more, I would say, a little more about accountability rather than just training law enforcers about how to investigate human rights violation, which is important. But again, as I said, that is not that is a need of the country, but not at the moment when people are dying.
Yeah. Interesting points, sir. Down to our last and probably most important point of this discussion. Um, Nakita natin, aside from, cooperating with the ICC and not necessarily rejoining agad, but just, cooperating with the ICC to investigate the killings under the Davao Death Squad and the drug war killings, maraming pang problema ang kinakaharap yung Pilipinas in terms of human rights situation. There's red tagging, there's terror tagging, um, people are getting killed, people are getting abducted. Instead of, passing an administrative order or signing an administrative order like this one, AO number 22, ano po ba dapat yung ginawa or gagawin or dapat gawin ng Marcos administration para mapakita niya or mapakita ng administrasyon na ito na totoong iba sila from the previous administration at totoong seryoso sila in addressing the dire human rights situation in the country?
Well, that is the crux of all of this, Jairo. I think, and we've said this, and many other groups have said this. If the Marcos administration is really serious about human rights, there are a lot of things that it can do to show that. Not another layer of bureaucracy that we fear would just be, useless, toothless is what we call it. One, Mr. Marcos needs to stop the drug war policy because people are still dying in drug-related incidents across the country, regardless of what he or his government tell the international community. The drug war is still in effect because the policy is still there. So he needs to do that. Second, he needs to cooperate with the ICC, as we pointed out. There's not, even, and they cannot continue invoking the question of jurisdiction because that's, they're talking about jurisdiction as if the moment the Philippines withdrew from the Rome Statute, wala nang jurisdiction. No, even in the Rome Statute that we ratified, it says there that cases that occurred during the time when we were still a member are still within the jurisdiction of the ICC, and the ICC is well within its mandate to investigate those. Three, Mr. Marcos needs to really stop this campaign against activists, against dissent, by stopping the red tagging and all of that. He needs to tweak the counterinsurgency campaign program of the government to eliminate, the red tagging, that constricts the democratic space. Now, we know that red tagging is part of the counterinsurgency program of the Philippine government, which is enforced by the NTF-ELCAC and the military. But, we've always said the Philippine government has a duty, has a responsibility to confront the threats against the government, but it has to do it in a rights-respecting manner. And red tagging is not a rights-respecting way to do it. And, issues of accountability for enforced disappearances, attacks on indigenous peoples and environment defenders, these are pressing issues. While the government says, okay, there are programs to fix the judiciary, the criminal justice system, in order to deal with all of that problem. I mean, that is well and good, and we support that. But again, Mr. Marcos needs to have the political will to try to come up with something strong, something quick to stop all of this from still happening. And that we don't see that. And that this AO, this special committee, is not going to do that because of all the various reasons that we've already enumerated. And foremost of them is the fact that the same members of the committee are also the same people and agencies that are responsible for many of these abuses.
Yeah, good point, sir. The drug war memorandum signed by Duterte in 2016 is still there. Marcos refuses to repeal that memorandum or to retract that memorandum. the Marcos administration also refuses to abolish the NTFL CAC, and the long list goes on. Thank you so much for your time, Carlos Conde of Human Rights Watch. If you're interested to continue our conversation, you can download our Rappler app and we can continue our conversation in the Justice and Human Rights channel. You can download the app using the QR code by scanning the QR code below. Thank you so much for watching. This has been Rappler Talk.